and his perspective on the importance of mobile technology in the developing world, please welcome the founder of the William J. Clinton Foundation and 42nd President of the United States, President Bill Clinton.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I've been backstage for a few minutes looking at all these new devices. And it reminded me that when I became president, the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. Now, I know that was 20 years ago, but as you get older, it won't seem like so long. There were, on the day I took the oath of office, a grand total of 50 sites on the entire internet. 50. More than that had been added since I started talking. And amazing things have happened, including Samsung's Hope for Children, which I very much admire and appreciate. I wanted to talk to you just a few minutes about where all this is going and where I hope it will lead. I've always been fascinated by the role of technology in human history and in the future. And when I was president and the internet was just beginning to boom, and information technology generated so much of our employment, 8% of our employment, but more than 20% of our job growth and more than 25% of our income growth, I did what I could to keep the internet free for speech and for commerce, to spread its reach throughout the United States and around the world, and to symbolize things. Believe it or not, no president had ever engaged online in a town hall conversation before I first did it. And I sent the first email into outer space to a space mission which included a former senator from Ohio and one of our first space heroes, John Glenn, who was then 77 years old, going up into space to examine the impact of weightlessness on the aging process. I'm about ready to do that myself. This electronics show shows how much technology has changed and what we can look forward to. And as I said, I was utterly fascinated by this when I saw it. I know that technology is really important to America and every other developing country. It can help us reform our systems. And that's what all the rich countries suffering low growth and a maldistribution of population in terms of having more people who are older and fewer people in their working years and the birth rate dropping. Technology's got a lot to do to deal with that. In the United States, during my wife's recent health challenges, I got a chance to see the electronic record system now being implemented at the George Washington University Medical Center. I think that it's one of the things that can help us both to improve the quality of health care and to slow the rate of increase, which if we don't do it, will consign the United States to a very bleak economic future. We simply cannot afford to keep spending $1 trillion more a year on healthcare than we would spend if we had any other country's system in the world. I also believe that there's a lot we have to do within the technology area itself. South Korea is now #1 in the world in computer download speeds. We have fallen to 15th. Our speeds are about 1/4 theirs. And that's largely, it's misleading because it's a big country, and in several places we're highly competitive and in other places we fall off the map. We need to see the internet as part of our global commitment to infrastructure. And I hope that there will be an infrastructure bank set up in the United States this year, and I hope part of its commitment will be to guarantee universal broadband access at competitive speeds. I spend most of my time, however, as you saw from the film, in parts of the world where people don't even take basic systems for granted. I mean, you're all here thinking about all these new apps, but think about all the basic things we're taking for granted. You'd be shocked if the video failed and my screen went dark, or if the lights went out, or the microphone failed, or the air conditioning failed. If you get bored with my speech, you can excuse yourself and get a glass of water. I spend a lot of time in parts of the world where people can't take any of that for granted. And in those places too, technology can be profoundly important. A couple of years ago, the United Nations reports talked about how mobile technology had done more to lift the poor than any other technology in history. The World Bank estimated that each 10% increase in cell phone penetration in a poor place added 0.6% to GDP growth. And I have seen that. When I worked in South Asia after the tsunami in late 2004, when we began to put families back in the fishing business who had lost their fishing boats, in Sri Lanka and Indonesia, we gave them all cell phones, and on average, they increased their income by 30% simply by being able to use the cell phones to check what the fish prices were 30 miles up and down the coast so they couldn't be ripped off. I have seen this in other ways as well. In Haiti, where I worked, even before the earthquake in late 2010, or early 2010, excuse me, we had only 10% of the Haitians with bank accounts. The banks were making their money off remittances, charging a fee to convert American dollars or other foreign currency into local Haitian gourds. And there was almost no consumer banking at all. Only 10% of the Haitians had a bank account. On the other hand, they didn't have much money. 70% of them were living on less than $2 a day. But 80% of them had a cell phone. So the head of Digicel, Dennis O'Brien, who is one of my partners in the Clinton Global Initiative and leads our Haiti project, and the Canadian bank, Scotiabank, decided to offer cell banking services. And today, they can get cash withdrawals, make deposits, do transfers using mobile phones without traditional bank accounts. They're in the banking business. So this is all really exciting to me. And I'm looking forward to what happens next. You know, one of the terrible things that happens to you when you get to be president is you never get to drive anymore. And driving has become a high-tech experience. A young man who runs my home in New York just bought a Ford. He said, "Come sit in this car." And I was sitting there, and he said, and he programmed me, he said, "Ask me a question." I said, "Where's the nearest Chinese restaurant?" And immediately I got a map that showed me how to drive to the nearest Chinese restaurant, which I did not know before. And I began thinking about this in terms of the future, so I want to leave you with a few thoughts. The world has huge challenges, which I think technology can help to overcome, that are non-economic. If you look at what the Arab Spring did to use social networks to try to topple oligarchies, we realize that it's not a total solution because the messy real world still requires more than virtual interconnections to do political protests. But I'm really pleased that under my wife's leadership, the State Department's done more to use the social media than ever before to try to at least make people aware of these challenges, and particularly to empower women and girls around the world. The three biggest challenges the world faces are vast chasms of inequality in education, healthcare, access to capital, access to jobs that pay a decent living, instability on everything from the financial crisis to vulnerability to terror, and the looming crisis of climate change, which now that America just had the hottest year ever recorded by 1 degree, perhaps the deniers will finally be quieted. But none of them can be solved unless we are committed to a positive vision, one of shared prosperity and shared responsibilities for dealing with our challenges, and a shared sense of community that embraces our diversity. And we're not there yet. Just look at what we've seen in recent days, the terrible death after beating and rape of this young woman in India. The young woman in Pakistan who was shot because she was so determined to get an education and was a symbol and was at risk, according to the men who thought they had to control women in order to count, of encouraging other young women to want to use their minds and develop their best qualities. The young woman in Afghanistan who was #1 in her class and wanted to go to medical school, whose parents had arranged a marriage for her with a man who thought that was unseemly and wanted her to drop out, who was so desperate she jumped off a house and tried to kill herself, and instead wound up with a broken back. Her parents agreed to cancel the marriage. The gender court in Afghanistan agreed to approve it. I'm still hoping she gets to go to college and become a doctor. Are all the examples all over the world, including here in the United States, of human trafficking in children and in young women? There are more. If you look at the continuing problems in the Middle East and the denial of the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians by some, if you look at the problems in China with dealing with the diversity presented by Tibet or the Muslims in northwest China, even as it seems that Taiwan and China have reached some sort of accommodation because so many Chinese work for Taiwanese-owned companies. Or if you look in the United States at this raging debate we're about to have over our absolutely unjustifiable neglect of gun safety. And if you I signed the assault weapons ban, which limited these ammunition clips to 10 bullets back in 1995, and it led to a massacre of the members of Congress who voted it. The gun lobby beat the Speaker of the House, they beat the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who was one of the most distinguished members of Congress, and any number of other members by terrifying people who live mostly in smaller towns in rural America that we were coming to get their guns because an enormous amount of the money that they get comes from gun manufacturers. So that it's no longer even an argument about whether you have a right to keep and bear arms at home in self-defense or whether you need the weapons for sports shooting or hunting. Nobody even seriously considers that. Now the argument is if everybody just had a gun everywhere, nothing bad would happen. Now we say that even though the gun death rate in America is 6 times, 10 times, 20 times more than the average of virtually every other OECD country. Chile is the next highest because a lot of people have guns. And I grew up in this hunting culture, but this is nuts. Why does anybody need a 30 round clip for a gun? Why does anybody need one of those things that carries 100 bullets? A guy in Colorado had one of those. Half of all the mass killings in the United States have occurred since the assault weapons ban expired in 2005. Half of all in the history of the country. So I hope that former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and other people who have stepped up after the Newtown tragedy will have some impact on this. Do there need to be some armed guards in some schools where there's a high crime rate and the kids themselves may take weapons to school? Absolutely. But it is not an excuse not to deal with this issue. We don't, primarily because of the way we are divided and the way we look at the world, and because people can be frightened into believing that somehow the government is their enemy and the police are impotent, and the only way that we'll ever have a free country is if everybody's got a gun, free to shoot everybody else on sight, would preferably concealed. And it is an example of the kinds of divisions that threaten the modern world. Is our diversity going to be a source of division or strength? Will we look at each other as adversaries or opportunities? And in this too, the virtual world offers us an opportunity to come together to have honest conversations. One of the problems we have in America is that we have sorted ourselves out in our living patterns so that we look for people who agree with us. It's very funny. America has come so far. We're not as racist as we used to be. We're not as sexist as we used to be. We're not as homophobic as we used to be. After losing 31 times in referendums, gay marriage prevailed in referendums in this election season. The only remaining bigotry we have is we just don't want to be around people who disagree with us. And you're laughing, but let's take some geographical boundaries that don't change with the census, like congressional districts. They're redrawn. When the incoming Secretary of State, Senator John Kerry, opposed President Bush for re-election, he gave him the closest re-election of any president to win re-election since Woodrow Wilson in 1916. About 30 years earlier, when President Jimmy Carter was elected in a narrow race, about 1% over President Gerald Ford, you had a similar election outcome. In the first race in 1976, only 20% of America's counties voted for one or the other by more than 20 points. In other words, 80% of the counties in America, friends and neighbors were discussing the election, having civil arguments, debating the issues back and forth. By 2004, in the Kerry-Bush race, 48% of the counties voted for one or the other by more than 20 points. So in America, it's not just in developing countries and troubled countries. We've been sorting ourselves out by our beliefs in a way that weakens the growing diversity and the potential of the country. So I think we need to think about this. I had an amazing lunch in Silicon Valley a few weeks ago with about 24 young internet entrepreneurs, including Salman Khan, who started the Khan Academy, which now has given their 20-minute lessons to millions of people around the world, bringing us together in a commitment to knowledge. I ask you to think about how all these devices can be used to bridge the remaining divides in the world. We have not all the time in the world to do something serious about climate change. I am convinced we can do it and make it good economics. And I think it's really important to do. I have these climate change projects around the world. I'm telling you, changing the way we produce and consume energy would do more to grow the American economy and grow the economy of poor countries than you can imagine. In the Caribbean, where I work, they already have the highest electric rates in the world. Distributed solar is already economical there without subsidies. But there are lots of things we can do, only if we are committed to a future that we share. Shared prosperity, shared responsibilities, a shared sense of community. Because make no mistake about it, climate change will affect us all, instability will affect us all, raging inequality of opportunity and incomes and access to employment will affect us all. We are going to share the future. What you are doing can make sure that we share the upside and minimize the downside. It is the job of every citizen on the planet, and you can lead the way. Thank you very much.